B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn Pesachim Daf Gimel. We're going to start 8 lines from the top of the Amud. And just before we get back into the sugya, we saw on Daf Chof Aleph Amud Beis there was a machlekes Chizkiah and Rabbi. Chizkiah maintained that the term lo yeh ochel, something should not be eaten, which is different to the typical lo yoicha, lo seichlu, don't eat. It's a different type of a term. And therefore Chizkiah says that when we have the term lo yeh ochel, that means that not only it is osar ba'achila, it's also osar b'hana. One's not allowed to derive any benefit from it. Rabbi argues the Chizkiah and says that there's no difference between lo yeh ochel and any other terms that are used, and lo yeh ochel is the same as lo yoicha, lo soichal, lo soichlu, etc. And he says that the way that Chizkiah was put down on Daf Chof Aleph Amud Beis, he says that in all terms that are used that say that something is osar to eat, it is also osar to have hana from, unless the Torah explicitly says otherwise. And we're going to see later on in today's daf, we'll recap one small detail with that, where it's a little bit different. But that was the machlekes Chizkiah and Rabbi. On Daf Chof Aleph, we saw the Gemara discussed Chometz on Pesach, where it says Lo Yeh Ochel. The Gemara discussed Nevela, and the Gemara discussed Treifa. On Daf Chof Beis, we saw the Gemara discusses Git Hanoshe, Dam, Eiver Menachai, Sheir Haniskel, and Orla. And now in today's daf, on Daf Chof Gimel, we're going to see the Gemara discussing another number of halachas. Says the Gemara, V'harei Truma. In the parasha of Truma, and we know there are 2 different types of Truma. There's Truma which every person has to bring, called Truma Gedola, and has to give to a Kohen. And there's Trumas Maisa, which is the Levi gets Maisa Rishon, of which he has to take 10% and give to the Kohen. That's called Trumas Maisa. And the pasuk that the Gemara is referring to here is actually referring to Trumas Maisa, but Rashi explains that the same applies to the Truma Gedola. Vari Truma. In the parasha of Truma, the Rachman Omar, the pasuk says, V'chol zor lo yoichel kodesh. Any stranger, anyone who's not a kohen, is not allowed to eat kodesh, which is food that is holy, that is sacred, referring to Trumas Maisa, referring to Truma. He's not allowed to eat it, and the pasuk says lo yoichel. It doesn't say lo yeh ochel, it just says lo yoichel. So according to Chizkiah, it will be mutar b'hana. It doesn't say lo yeh ochel. According to Rabbi, it should be osar b'hana. However, none we learned in a Mishnah, ma'arvin lenozir b'yayin uli Yisrael b'truma, that one is allowed to derive benefit from Truma. It says that even a Yisrael who's not a Kohen is not allowed to eat the Truma. He's allowed to use for his Eruvei Tchumin, he's allowed to put down a food item, which is Truma. And that's clear that he's deriving benefit from Truma. Exactly how you can put down food that you cannot eat is a separate discussion. Rashi addresses that here. Rashi says that theoretically speaking, you can be shoyel, you can undo the Truma, but either way, even in the state of Truma, where at this point he cannot eat it, it's Truma, he's allowed to rely on it for his Eruv Tchumin. He's having hana from it. And in the same Mishnah it says that a Nazir who's not allowed to drink wine is allowed to use wine for his Eruv Tchumin. So you see here clearly, let's focus on the Truma for now. The Gemara will soon come to the Nazir, to the Yain, that you see clearly in the Mishnah, a Yisrael is allowed to benefit from the Truma, even though it says Lo Yoichal, and according to Rabbi, Lo Yoichal includes an Isser Hana. Answers the Gemara Omer of Papa says, here again, similar to almost all the cases we've had till now, we have a pasuk that teaches us that even though it says Lo Yoichal, you're allowed to have Hana. Shan Yehosam de Omar Kra, the pasuk says, Utrumaschem, the pasuk says, V'nechshav lochem trumaschem kadogon min agerin u'kamaleo min hayokev, that it says it's your truma, which means it's true that it's truma, and its truma means you're not allowed to eat it if you're not a kohen. However, it's yours. The pasuk that says trumaschem shalochem tehei, you're allowed to derive benefit from it. So we have an explicit pasuk. Asks the Gemara v'idoch, and according to Chizkiah, where Chizkiah held that lo yoichal never means issa hana, so he doesn't need the word trumaschem to tell me that it's your truma, that you're allowed to have hana from it. What's he going to do with the word trumaschem? Answers the Gemara, trumaschem de kol Yisrael ka'omar. It doesn't mean trumaschem, meaning it's yours for you to have benefit. No, it means all of yours truma, all the trumas within Klal Yisrael, Trumaschem Dechol Yisrael, all the Trumas Maisa within Klal Yisrael, which is not Yisrael, it's referring to Leviim, but all of the Trumas Maisa in Klal Yisrael, that's what the Pasuk is talking about, that Nechshav Lechem Trumaschem, Kadogon Min HaGoyer Nukam Leo Min HaYokev. But it's not there to teach me that it's for your benefit. Continues the Gemara. V'harei Nozir. Let's move on now to Nozir. A Nozir is somebody who's not allowed to drink any wine or have any or is not allowed to eat or drink anything that comes from grapes. V'harei Nozir. The Rachmana Omar, the Pasuk says by the Nozir, Kol Yemei Nizroi, all the days of his Nazirus, Asher Ye'oseh Migefen, anything that's made of grapes or from a vine, Hayayin, the wine, Michartzanim V'adzog, from the skins of the grapes to the seeds in the grapes, Loi Yoichil, he's not allowed to eat them. So it says clearly Lo Yoichil. According to Chizkiah, Lo Yoichil just means don't eat it. It doesn't mean a Noz is not allowed to have Hana. However, according to Chizkiah, all terms of Isser Achila include Isser Hana. According to Rabbi, Lo Yoichil should mean that a Nazir is not allowed to have Hana. Utnan, and the Gemara asks from the Mishnah we saw just a few lines earlier, Ma'arvin le-Nazir b'yayin. A Nazir is allowed to use wine for his Eruv Tchumin. He's having benefit. He's using this Eruv to allow him to go outside his Tchum. How is a Nazir allowed to have Hana if it says Lo Yoichel? So the Gemara is going to suggest two answers. The first one, Omar Mazutra, Shani Hosom, de Omar Kro Nizroi. The Pasuk says, that very Pasuk says, Kol Yemei Nizroi, it's his Nazirus, which means that it's true, there's halachas of Nazirus, but they're his, which means that even the things he's not allowed to eat, he's allowed to have benefit from. And therefore, he's allowed to have benefit from the wine, even though he's not allowed to eat it. That was Marzutra. Rav Ashi says, no. Rav Ashi says, I learned it from a different source. The Pasuk says, also regarding the Nazir, Kodesh Yeh, that, and here's talking about the Gadil Pera, Sa'ar Roishay. It's talking about the hair that grows on his head, that it's Kodesh, it's holy, it's sacred, and one's not allowed to have Hana from it. One has to burn the hair of a Nazir when his Nazirus days are over. So what's the Gemara learn from that? The Gemara learns from there that Giduloi Kodesh, only the hair that grows on his head has this halacha of Kodesh, which is Osir B'Hana. Ve'in davar acher kodesh, but anything else which is osir to a nazir, namely anything that comes from grapes and from a vine, that's not going to be kodesh, is not going to be osir b'hana, and so you have a pasuk that says it's mutar b'hana. Asks the Gemara against Rav Ashi, midi ve'in davar acher ksiv. There's no word in this pasuk that's teaching us that only the hair on his head is Kodesh to the exclusion of anything else. There's no excluding term in the Pasuk, so why would we have thought that the word Kodesh is only for the hair and not for anything else? And we have no reason to believe that Lo Yoichel, according to Rabbi, doesn't mean Issa Hana. The question comes back, how is the Nazir allowed to have Hana from the wine? And the Gemara says, Elo mechaverta, the correct and the best answer to the question is Kad Marzutra, is like Marzutra says that we learn it from the word Nizroi, it's his Nazirus, which means in spite of the fact that there's things he's not allowed to eat, they are still his to derive benefit from. Continues the Gemara, V'harei Chodosh. We know that one is not allowed to eat the new produce of the year until the Korban Omer on the second day of Pesach, on the 16th of Nisan, has been brought in the Beis HaMikdash. V'harei Chodosh, regarding the Issa of Chodosh, the Rachmana Omar, the Pasuk said, V'lechem, the bread, V'koli, which is the roasted kernels, the caramel are the more fatter and plump kernels, lo yiseichlu, you're not allowed to eat them, ad etzem hayom hazeh, till the very day, ad haviachem es korban, aleikeichem chuk hasolim deroisechem chol moshvesechem. That the Pasuk says, till the korban omer is brought, you're not allowed to eat. And it says, lo yiseichlu. You're not allowed to eat chodosh. According to Chizkiah, that means don't eat it. But it doesn't say lo yeh ochil. It says lo seichlu, which means that you're just not allowed to eat it. You're allowed to have hana from it. However, according to Rabbi says that any term of Issa Achila includes Issa Hana. It should be also to have any benefit from chodosh produce. V'utnan, however, we learned in the Mishnah, Kaitzer l'shachas, one is allowed to harvest the new produce even before the korban omer is brought, l'shachas, when it's yet unripe grains, in order for the animals to eat it. And you're even allowed to harvest fully grown and ripe grains in order to feed one's animals with it. So you see, clearly one's allowed to have benefit from the chodosh fruit, from the chodosh produce, even though it says in the pasuk, lo seichlu, you're not allowed to eat it. According to Rabbi, why are you allowed to give it to your animals to eat? Answers the Gemara, Omer of Shemaiah, Shan Yehosam. Here again, it's different. The Omar Kro, we have an explicit pasuk that says Ketzirchem. It's a different pasuk. Daber el bnei Yisrael v'amartu aleim ki savayu el haaretz asher ani nosi nechem uktzartem es ktsira v'haveisem es oimer reishis ketzirchem. That the oimer is the reishis ketzirchem. It's the first reaping that you're allowed to do, the first harvesting that you're allowed to do, and it says ketzirchem. From that ketzirchem, it tells you that even though you're not allowed to eat the chodosh, ketzirchem shelochem yehei, that you're allowed to have benefit. It's allowed to be for your benefit, even though you're not allowed to eat it until the korban omer is brought. Asks the Gemara v'idach, according to Chizkiah, who never would have thought that it's also b'hana, why does he need the word ketzirchem? So the Gemara says, similar to what we saw before, Ketzirchem dechol Yisrael mashma. It's not coming to tell me Ketzirchem that it's harvesting, it's reaping, that you're allowed to have benefit. It's for your use. Ketzirchem, for you to benefit. No, Ketzirchem means the Ketzira, the reaping, the harvesting of all of Klal Yisrael. That regarding all their harvesting, these halachas applies that one's not allowed to eat them till the korban omer has been brought, but one is allowed to have hana. Continues the Gemara. Vari shrotzim. Shrotzim are crawling creatures, certain crawling creatures. Vari shrotzim d'rachmona omar. The pasuk says regarding the shrotzim, v'chol hasheretz hashoretz ala oretz. Any of these crawling creatures, sheketz hu, they are an abomination. Lo yeh ochel. Here we have the term lo yeh ochel. So it would seem that we're now going to ask a question both on Rebavo and on Chizkiah, because the term lo yeh ochel, even according to Chizkiah, means you're not allowed to have hana. According to Rabbi, any term of Issa Achila includes Issa Hana. It says in the pasuk, Sheketzu lo yeh ochel. Utnan, however, we see in the Mishnah, Tzaydei chaya v'oifois v'dogim, the hunters, those that trap chayos, which is wild animals, beasts, v'oifois, or birds, v'dogim, or fish, shenizdamnu lahem, that chanced upon minim tmeim, species that are tomei, mutorin lemoichron lenochrim. If you chanced upon them, you're allowed to sell them to a goy. How can you sell them to a goy? It says lo yeh ochel. Lo yeh ochel means not only you're not allowed to eat these tomei species, you're not even allowed to have hana from them. You're not allowed to derive any benefit from them. How can you sell them to a goy? Answers the Gemara, Shani Hasam. There it's different to Omakro. It says in the pasuk, it says explicitly lochem. That's in another pasuk. The pasuk says v'sheketz yeh lochem mibsaram lo yisechilu v'esnivlosam teshaketzu. Since it says lochem, shelochem yehei, it's allowed to be for you. Asks the Gemara, if you say that from the word lochem, it means that you're allowed to derive benefit from these crawling creatures, afilu lekatchilenami. The term used in the Mishnah that shenizdamnu lehem minim tameim, they chanced upon the impure species, would seem that it's only if you've chanced upon them you're allowed to sell them to a goy, but you shouldn't hunt them in order to sell them to the goy. Asks the Gemara, why? Lekatchilenami. It says lochem, it says you're allowed to have hana. So why can you not hunt them in order to sell them to the goy? Answers the Gemara, no. Shani hacha de omar kro. The pasuk says yiyu. It says v'sheketz yiyu lochem. from the Yiu means B'havyosam Yihu. They should remain an abomination for you. That means you should deal with them as if they're an abomination, which means do not chase them, do not trap them in order to sell them. No, they're an abomination. If, however, you chanced upon them, you're allowed to have hana from them, lochem, you're allowed to sell them to a goy. Asks the Gemara, Ulechizkia, lo moli lemichtav lo ye ochel, umaisi lochem lemishrei. According to Rabbi, any term that would have been used to say that one's not allowed to eat the shrotzim would have meant it's also asar b'hana, and we would have needed lochem to say that it's mutar b'hana. According to Chizkiah, the only reason you need lochem to say it's mutar b'hana is because the Torah used the term lo ye ochel. Well, if the Torah is going to allow you to have anar from them, why is the Torah using the term lo ye ochel and then writing lochem? The Torah should have used any of the other terms of isar achila, and then we would have known that it's mutar b'hana. You wouldn't need the lochem. Why does it say the strong term of lo ye ochel and then need lochem to allow you to have anar? The Torah should have used any of the other terms besides for lo ye ochel, lochem, and then I would not have needed the word lochem to permit having hana from these shrotzim. Chizkiah says, this is the source of what I hold. Chizkiah, what do I say? I say that all other terms of isachila only mean isachila, they do not mean an isahana. Besides for when it says lo ye ochel. Where do I know that from? I know it from here. From the very fact that the Torah says by shrotzim, lo ye ochel, and nonetheless it also says lochem. So I, Chizkiah, thought to myself, why does the Torah have to say lochem? You're allowed to have anar from it. The Torah never said it was asar b'hana. The Torah only said lo ye ochel. So I, Chizkiah, understood from here that it must be that whenever it says lo ye ochel, it means it's asar b'hana, and that's why over here the Torah wrote lochem. So exactly in order to teach us that every time it says lo ye ochel, that means it's hana, that's why the Torah here wrote lo ye ochel, and then excluded it by saying lochem. Continues the Gemara. V'harei chometz. And the truth is that on Daf Chof Aleph Amud Beis we already discussed chometz. We discussed that chometz is asar b'hana on Pesach, and the Gemara discussed Chizkiah and Rabbi over there. However, there's one opinion that says that chometz on Pesach is actually mutar b'hana, and that's Rabbi Yossi Aglili. V'harei chometz b'Pesach, Omar lo ye ochel chometz. The pasuk says lo ye ochel, which means according to everybody, it should be asar to have hana from chometz on Pesach. V'tani, we learned in a brisa, Rabbi Yossi Aglili oimer. Rabbi Yossi Aglili is actually responding to those who say that one's not even allowed to have hana from chometz after Pesach. Chometz that was around on Pesach belonging to Yisrael, one's not allowed to use after Pesach. And Rabbi Yossi Aglili commented on that and said, Tameh alatzmacho, you should be wondering to yourself, hey, chometz asar b'hana kol shiva. You're talking about chometz being asar b'hana after Pesach. You should be wondering to yourself where the source is that chometz is asar b'hana on Pesach. The Torah doesn't say it's asar b'hana, it just says lo ye ochel, you're not allowed to eat it. So you see clearly from that brisa that Rabbi Yossi Aglili, even though it says lo ye ochel, he understood it means that it's mutar b'hana. And this is a question also on Chizkiah, also on Rabbi, who both hold that if it says lo ye ochel, it means that it's asar b'hana. Answers the Gemara, Shani Hasam, over there chometz is different. The Omakra, it says in the pasuk explicitly, lo yiroeh lecho so'ir. That it's true that you're not allowed, chometz is not allowed to be seen, so'ir, which is leaven, a type of a yeast, is not allowed to be seen by Yisrael. But it says lecho. Lecho is there to teach you that even though you're not allowed to eat it, it's for you. You're allowed to have benefit from it. That's how Rabbi Yossi understood, Rabbi Yossi Aglili understood the lecho. The Rabbanon, according to the Rabbanon who argue the Rabbi Yossi Aglili, and they say that chometz is asar b'hana on Pesach, what are they going to do with the lecha? Answers the Gemara, it's to teach us that the whole issa of not seeing chometz is only if it's yours. But chometz that belongs to somebody else, which we've already seen in the sugya early on at the beginning of the Masechta, referring to a goy, or shel gavoya, or it belongs to hektish, there's no issa of bal yiroeh. V'idach, how is Rabbi Yossi Aglili going to learn that the issa of lo yiroeh is limited to yours if he learns out from lecha to say that even your chometz is mutar b'hana? Says Rabbi Yitzchok, trei lecha ksivi. It actually says twice in the pasuk the word lecha. One to tell you that you're allowed to have anah from any chometz, and one to tell you that the restrictions of Bal Yirayah only apply to if it's yours, not if it belongs to somebody else. Asks the Gemara Ve'idach, according to the Chachamim, what do they need the extra lecha for? Answers the Gemara, Chad b'nochri shekivashtei, v'chad b'nochri sheloi kivashtei. We need an extra pasuk to tell us that not only a guy who you do not dominate over him, and his money is not considered as if it's yours, that his chometz is not under the restriction of Bal Yirayah, but even a guy who is kivashtoi, that you dominate over him, and his money is considered like your money, nonetheless, lo Yirayah does not apply to that chometz. Asks the Gemara Ve'idach, and how is Rabbi Yossi going to know that halacha? Answers the Gemara, Klasik lecha ksivi. It actually says 3 times lecha. So Rabbi Yossi, he learns one of them to say that your chometz is mutar b'hana, one of them to tell you lecha yataroya v'lataroya shel acherim shel hektish shel gavoya, and the other one to tell me that even if it's a nachri shekivashtoi. Ve'idach, but according to the Chachamim, who they do not learn out from one lecha that it's mutar b'hana, they have one lecha to say shelecha yataroya avlataroya shel acherim shel gavoya. The second lecha to say that even a nachri shekivashtoi is not included in Bal Yirayah. What do they do with the third lecha? Says the Gemara, Chad b'sa'ir v'chad b'chometz. That one is to tell us that the restrictions of chometz apply to sa'ir, which is leaven, what we may call yeast, which is in and of itself inedible, but it can make other doughs rise and become leaven. And one is for chometz, which is a regular chometz, which cannot make something else leaven, but in and of itself, it's chometz and is edible. Utzrichi, and the Gemara says in Beit Daf Zayin Amud Beis that we need the special pasuk, an added word in the pasuk to say that the restrictions of chometz apply to both of these types of chometz. Continues the Gemara. So we've more or less now finished. We've learned 13 topics that in all of them there's some term of Isser Achila, and we've learned through all 13 according to Chizkiah and according to Rebbe Avo. Says the Gemara, could it be that this concept, that Rebbe Avo says that any term of Isser Achila, it also means Issa Hana, and Chizkiah argues with that and says only Lo Yeh Ochel means Issa Hana, but any other Issa Achila does not mean Issa Hana? Could that be actually Machlekes Tanoim? Why? Because it says as follows. It says in the Pasuk, and this is regarding the Issa of Chelev. There's different fats of the animals. There are some fats that are regularly mutar b'hana, and they are called shumon. There are fats that are osa b'hana. They're osa b'achila, sorry. They're not allowed to be eaten. And it's learnt out, it says from the Pasuk, lo se chelu, that one's not allowed to eat certain fats, and those fats are called chelev. The question is, are those fats mutar b'hana or not? And the pasuk here that the Gemara is going to discuss is speaking about the fats of a nevela. A nevela in and of itself has a certain level of tumah and is not allowed to be eaten. And the Gemara is discussing what's the status of the fats of the chelev, which normally in the kosher behemoth would be also to be eaten. What's the status of those chalovim, those fats in a nevela animal? And the pasuk says, "V'chelev nevela, v'chelev treifa." These fats of nevela or treifa, you can use them for whatever you want, for any use, but obviously you're not allowed to eat it. So the pasuk says, it can be used for any work, for any use. This word lechol seems to be extra. What's it teaching us? What's the pasuk teaching us that to include that? Not that you're not only allowed to use these chalevs, you're allowed to use it for kol malacha, for anything. Sheyochel, I may have thought, lemeleches kavoya yehi mutar. These chalevs, they actually go onto the mizbeach. It's part of the korban. So I may have thought that when the pasuk says that you're allowed to use the chalev, it only means that the hektish chalev is allowed to be used, is mutar b'hana. Mutar lemeleches hedyet tehe osur. But I may have thought that fats, these fats belonging to nevela or treifa, regarding a hedyet, just a personal private use of an individual, not hektish, I may have thought that they are osur b'hana. Talmud Leima, that's why I need a special word in the pasuk, lekol malacha. You're allowed to use these fats for anything, not only for hektish, you can even use it for a hedyot if it's not hektish. Divi Rabbi Yossi Aglili. That means Rabbi Yossi Aglili clearly entertained the idea that it should be osur to have anah from these chaylev, if not for the use of hektish. And for the use of hektish, it's easier to allow them to be used because these fats, they actually go on the mizbeach on it when the korban is kosher. Rabbi Akiva learns from this lechol something else. He's not learning about whether it's mutter or osur to have anah from it for a hedyot, for personal use. He's talking about whether the tumah of nevela applies even. Do we say it's only yochel lemeleches hedyot yehi toyer regarding chulin? These fats are deemed toyer, and that's what the pasuk would be telling you lechol malacha, that as far as chulin is concerned, these fats, even though nevela itself has a certain tumah on it, but regarding chulin, the chaylev, these fats are not part of the nevela and not in that bracket of nevela regarding tumah, and they are tohir. But lemeleches kavoya, but regarding hektish, and we've already learned at the end of the first parak that hektish is much easier to become tomei. Chulin can only become a sheni. Truma can become a shlishi letuma. Kodesh can even become a revi letuma. So I may have thought that meleches kavoya yehi tomei, that these fats regarding hektish, they are tomei, and if they were to touch hektish, it would make them tomei. Talmud Leima, according to Rabbi Akiva, that's why I need the pasuk of lechol malacha to say you're allowed to use these fats even for kodesh, and they will not deem the kodesh as tomei. Rabbi Yossi Aglili, the tumah or latara lo yitzchok kra. Rabbi Yossi Aglili does not need the pasuk of lechol malacha to tell me that these fats are not tomei even for kodesh. What do I need the pasuk? Just to tell me that I'm allowed to have hana from it, even when it's used for a hedyot. Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Akiva says to tell me that I'm allowed to use it and have hana from it, even for a hedyot use, that I do not need a pasuk for. When I do need the pasuk for, to tell me that even if it touches hektish, it's not going to make it tomei. This is the end of the brisa so far, and what we see in the brisa is there's actually no machleikus between Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva. They both hold that one's allowed to have benefit from these chaylev, from these fats of a nevela or treifa. You're allowed to have benefit from them even when you're having the use of a hedyot, not for the use of hektish. And both agree that these chaylevs would not make hektish tomei. The question is, which one do you need the pasuk for? According to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, I need a pasuk to tell me that I'm allowed to have hana, and I don't need the pasuk to tell me that they do not make kodesh tomei. And Rabbi Akiva says I don't need the pasuk to tell me that you're allowed to have hana from it, but I do need it to say that it doesn't make kodesh tomei. Says the Gemara, my love, let's assume that this is what they're arguing about. The Rabbi Yossi Aglili sovar lo yisoichlu, because the pasuk by chaylev says that chaylev is lo yisoichlu. You're not allowed to eat chaylev. Rabbi Yossi Aglili holds lo yisoichlu mashma bein isa achila bein isa hana. The word lo yisoichlu actually means, like Rabbi Vo said, that it means that you're not allowed to have an isa hana. So when I need the pasuk v'chi osakra lemishra lenevela bahana. So when it says that I'm allowed to use this nevela, when the pasuk says ye'ose lechol malacha, I need the pasuk to tell me that you're bechlal allowed to have hana from it. That it should be mutar bahana at all. So he says that I need a pasuk to tell me it's mutar bahana. So I need the lechol to tell me not only is it mutar bahana for hektish, it's even mutar bahana for hedyot. Rabbi Akiva Sava. However, Rabbi Akiva says, Isa achile mashma, Isa hana loy mashma. Rabbi Akiva holds, like Chizkiah learned all along, that lo yisoichelu never meant Isa hana. We never would have dawned on us that it should be Asa b'hana. Not for hektish and not for hedyot. It's mutar b'hana for everyone. V'chi asa kra. What do I need the pasuk for? L'tumah v'tara, to tell me that I can use it for anything, even for hektish. And these chaylevs, even though they come from a nevela, they are not going to make hektish and tomei. So far, the Gemara, it seems from the Gemara that the Machlokas Chizkiya and Rabbi is the Machlokas Rabbi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva. And the Gemara, when the Gemara asks this Lema Ketanoi, it's normally a question, because we're not so comfortable with the fact that there's two Ameroim arguing in exactly a point that two Tanoim are arguing in. Answers the Gemara, Loi. The Machlokas Rabbi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva is not whether the term Lo Seichelu means Osa Hana as well or not. The Kule Alma, it could be Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Aglili both hold Lo Seichelu mashma bein Isa Achila bein Isa Hana. They both hold that the term Lo Seichelu refers also to an Isa Hana. V'hacha b'haka miflagi. But this is what they were arguing about. Rabbi Aglili Sovar. Rabbi Aglili holds, Kashahutra Nevela, and this is something we discussed on Daf Chof Aleph Amud Beis, when the Torah explicitly allowed having Hana from Nevela, he hutra, only the flesh, the basar of the Nevela is considered Nevela, and is mutter to have Hana. You're allowed to sell it to a ger, to a goy, to give it to a ger, sell it to a goy, as we saw in the previous sugya. However, chelba, these fats, the gida and the gid hanoshe, that sinew, which is also to have enough, to also to eat, those two, they are not considered part of the nevela. And there's two fronts to this. That means loy hutru. Number one, that when it says in the posuk that one's allowed to have hana from nevela, it only means you're allowed to have hana from the flesh, but it does not automatically mean you're allowed to have hana from the chaylev or from the gid. And on the same token, if chaylev and gid is not called nevela, then the tumah that the Torah gave nevela only applies to the flesh of the nevela, not to the chaylev of the nevela, and not to the gid of the nevela. So that's what Rabbi Aglili holds. He says that the Torah, when the Torah allowed hana from the chaylev, it did not, from the nevela, sorry, it did not allow hana from the chaylev and gid. So now I need a special pasuk here, the pasuk that we're talking about of chaylev nevela v'chaylev treifa ya'aseh lekol melacha. I need that pasuk to tell us leheter hana. Leheter hana, to tell me you're allowed to have hana from the chaylev. Leheter hana hu da'aseh. It comes to teach me heter hana, and to tell me that it's not tomei. I don't need a pasuk for that, because in this, if the chaylev is not called nevela, in negea, in regards to the heter to have hana from it, and that's why I need a special pasuk. It's also not called nevela regarding tumah, and the chaylev is not tumah, not for hedyot and not for kodesh. So that's why Rabbi Aglili says I need the pasuk to tell me that the chaylev is mutter b'hana. Rabbi Akiva Sava. No, Rabbi Akiva says Kashahutra Nevela, when the Torah allowed Nevela to have hana from Chelba v'Gidon Nami Hutra. Rabbi Akiva holds that chaylev is called nevela. It's part of it has the same status as the flesh of the animal, and therefore when the Torah said that nevela is mutar b'hana, it's also mutar b'hana to have benefit from the chaylev, and I don't need an extra pasuk for that. However, if chaylev is called nevela, then in the same way as nevela carries tumah, so should the chaylev. So I need a pasuk. It's Zechra l'tumah v'tairos. I need this pasuk to say no. Even though the chaylev is called nevela, it's not in the same bracket as nevela regarding tumah and tara. Says the Gemara. Okay. Rabbi Aglili, according to the way we've explained it now, he says that chaylev and the gid is not included in nevela. Therefore, they're not tomei. And when the Torah says that nevela is mutar b'hana, it doesn't mean that chaylev is mutar b'hana, and that's why I need a special pasuk to tell me that chaylev is mutar b'hana. And when the pasuk says that nevela is mutar b'hana, it also doesn't tell me that gid is mutar b'hana. Or do we have a pasuk to say that gid is mutar b'hana? Rabbi Aglili, ashkechon chaylev deshari rachmana b'hana. We know that chaylev is mutar b'hana from the pasuk that we're discussing here of ya'aseh l'chol melacha. Gid nami name the aser, but regarding gid anoshe, are we going to say it's aser b'hana? According to Rabbi Akiva, the gid is part of nevela, and when the Torah said nevela is mutar b'hana, so is gid mutar b'hana. The question's only on Rabbi Aglili, who says that gid is not considered nevela. So when the pasuk says that nevela is mutar b'hana, we don't have such a pasuk for gid. Says the Gemara, okay, could be that gid is aser b'hana. we don't have an issue with that. And it could also be, you actually learn from a kal v'choime that gid is mutar b'hana. If somebody were to eat chaylev, the punishment is very serious, it's korus. And nonetheless, we've got a pasuk that says that it's mutar b'hana. Gid, if somebody who eats gid anoshe, he's not going to be chayiv korus. We can take it for granted that the Torah allows him to have benefit. Asks the Gemara, Reb Shimon de Osar, according to Reb Shimon, who says that Gid Anoshe is indeed Osar Bana, and this is something that we learnt about on Daf Chov Beis, this Reb Shimon, if it's also Bana, the question is, what's Reb Shimon going to do with this Kal V'chomer? How can Gid Anoshe be also Bana if Chaylev, which is a much more stringent punishment, is Mutar Bana? Answers the Gemara, Ikale Mifrach. Reb Shimon will say that I can ask a pircha, I can ask a question on this Kal V'chomer. You're making a Kal V'chomer assuming that Chaylev is more stringent, as you see from the punishment, and therefore if there's a leniency there that it's mutar b'hana, it should by default apply to gid, which is less stringent re its punishment. No. There's a stringency we find by gid anosha that we don't find by chaylev, because chaylev only ever applies to behema, to a domesticated animal. To a chaya, there's no issa gid hanosh, there's no issa of chaylev. However, gid hanoshe applies to all animals, to domesticated animals as well as to beasts, to wild animals. So if so, says Reb Shimon, it's true that chaylev has a stringency regarding the punishment, and it's mutar b'hana, but it could be that gid hanoshe, which is also even by chaya, which is not true regarding chaylev, maybe it's going to be osar b'hana, to have hana from the gid. Asks the Gemara v'idach, and Rabbi Aglili, who he did learn from this Kal V'chomer to say that if Chaylev is mutar b'hana, of course Gid Anoshe is mutar b'hana. Why is he not got the same question that we said according to Reb Shimon, that you cannot learn Gid Anoshe from Chaylev because Gid Anoshe has its own stringency that Chaylev doesn't have, that Chaylev is only osir by behema, not by chaya, and Gid Anoshe is also even by chaya. So how's he learning the Kal V'chomer? Says the Gemara, "Behema ka'amrinon." The pasuk of Chaylev that Rabbi Aglidi is bringing proof from there that it's mutar b'hana. This pasuk is talking about behema. That behema, there's an issa of Chaylev, that's clear, and it's mutar b'hana. And in behema itself, which is the pasuk where we're learning mutar hana from, there's no mutar b'chloloi, there's no place that behema has an exclusion from the issa of chaylev. He says the pasuk that says that chaylev is a mutar b'hana is behema kamrin, and I'm talking about behema. Behema mias lo yishtari. There's never a case in behema where the issa achila of chaylev doesn't apply, and therefore I can learn a Kal V'chomer. If by behema there's an issa of chaylev and nonetheless it's mutar b'hana, so too the gid anoshe, which or kol sheken the gid anoshe, which is more lenient, that it's not got a punishment of chorus, of course it's going to be mutar b'hana. And don't ask me that chaylev regarding chaya has a leniency over gid anoshe, because we're not talking about chaya, we're only talking about behema, that behema it's osar b'hana, it's osar b'achila, and if you eat the chaylev you chayav chorus, and nonetheless it's mutar b'hana. Gid anoshe, where there's no chorus, is also going to be mutar b'hana. Continues the Gemara. And now we've got to make a little bit of a summary of what we've learnt. We've learnt that the way the sugya started on Daf Chof Amud Beis, on Daf Chof Aleph Amud Beis, was that Chizkiah learns that the word lo yeh ochel means isar achila and isar hana. What was the source of Chizkiah? So we saw the source of Chizkiah was from Shrotzim, that it says in the pasuk lo yeh ochel, and nonetheless it says lochem, to come to teach us that whenever it says lo yeh ochel and there's not an explicit pasuk allowing hana, lo yeh ochel means issa hana. Rabbi, so the way the Gemara started, Rabbi said that any time where it says kol mokim shene'emar lo yoicha lo yiseicha lo yiseichlu It doesn't matter what the term is, it means echod isa achila, echod isa hana. It means isa achila and isa hana. Where does he learn it from? So the Gemara there at the beginning of the sugya said, he learned it out from the isa of nevela. Because by nevela it says lo yiseichlu. You're not allowed to eat nevela. And then the pasuk says explicitly that you're allowed to sell it, give it to a goy, where that means it's mutar b'hana. From the fact that the Torah had to tell me that it's mutar b'hana, you see that everywhere else where it says any term of isra achila, it actually means that it's osur b'hana. That's if you learn it from nevela. The Gemara then asked that that's all very good according to Rabbi Meir, that indeed says that with nevela, any type of hana is mutar, you're allowed to give it or sell it to either a regular goy or a geir, which is a specific type of a goy. And so according to Rabbi Meir, indeed, where all hana is mutar, that's what the pasuk is coming to teach us. However, the Gemara asked that, according to Rabbi Yehuda says that it's true that by nevela, the pasuk tells me that you're allowed to give it to a geir or sell it to a goy, but the pasuk is not telling me, that means the main purpose of the pasuk is not to tell me that you can have hana. It's actually to tell me that you're only allowed to give it to a geir, not sell it to a geir, or sell it to a goy and not give it to a goy. That means there's a special halacha that we learn out from those psukim by nevela. So according to that, Rabbi wouldn't be able to learn from the heter to sell it or give it to a goy, that anywhere else where it doesn't say a heter that any isa achila means isa hana. So how would Rabbi learn his status, his opinion from according to Rabbi Yehuda? So the Gemara says that according to Rabbi Yehuda, how Rabbi is not learning it, that Rabbi is not learning it from nevela. According to Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi is actually learning it from treifa. From treifa, it says that even though it says lo yiseichelu, you're not allowed to eat treifa. However, the pasuk says la kelev tashlichun oisai, that you're allowed to throw it to your dogs, which is benefit. Now, from the virtue of the fact that you can give it to your dogs, that's not yet enough reason that you're always allowed to have hana. So Rashi explains before that it could be the Torah wants to teach us that there's a special reward, there's a special mitzvah to give these treifas to the dogs as a reward for something virtuous that they did. However, there's an added word, oisai, lakelev tashlichun oisai, that only regarding treifa you're allowed to send it to your dogs, you're allowed to throw it to your dogs, but you're not allowed to give it to your dogs. That means you're not allowed to have hana elsewhere. So from that word oisai, which means elsewhere, there we learn that only to treifa you're allowed to give a dog, but any other isurim, any other isure achila, you're not allowed to have hana from. And that would be the source, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi would learn it from treifa, not from nevela. So that's a basic summary of what we've learnt. And another point that we've learnt, in almost all the 13 sugyas that we've learnt, whether it's chometz, nevela, treifa, gidanoshe, edam, eva menachayisher, aniskel, orla, truma, nozer, chodosh, shrotzim, and chelev, and all these sugyas that we've learnt, in the cases that you've had lo ye ochel, which is chometz and sheir haniskel, where everybody then agrees it's asa b'hana. There was no machlekes Chizkiah and Rabbi. In all the other cases where you had any term of isa achila besides for lo ye ochel, where according to Chizkiah, any other term of isa achila does not include isa hana. According to Rabbi, we asked all these questions against Rabbi, that in all those cases it's mutar b'hana. According to you, Rabbi, why is it mutar b'hana? And in each one, Rabbi had an answer. There's a special pasuk. Either with dam you learn out from mayim, and from Evi Menachai is learnt out from Dam, and Truma it says Trumaschem, and Nozer it says Nizroi, and Chodosh it says Ketzirchem, and Shrotzim it says Lochem. In every case, you've always got a pasuk that Rabbi said, even though it says Isa Achila, it's Mutar B'hana. Bottom line, the end of the day, there's no Machlekes Chizkiah and Rabbi anywhere. Where are they arguing? That's what the Gemara is going to address now. Mechti, oisvinu kol hanikroi. We've asked questions from all these psukim. V'shoninu, Chizkiah Rabbi, and also Chizkiah and also Rabbi explained all these psukim, that everybody agrees when it's mutar b'hana, when it's asa b'hana. There's no machlekes between them. But my pligi, where are they arguing? Answers the Gemara. B'chometz b'Pesach v'aliba d'Rabbanon and b'Sheir HaNiskel aliba d'Divrei HaKel. There are two places where they both agree that it's also b'Hana. And that is by Chometz Pesach where it says Lo Ye'ochel, and by B'Sheir HaNiskel. B'Sheir HaNiskel also says Lo Ye'ochel. And they both agree it's also b'Hana. And what are they arguing about? They're arguing about where do we learn it from. Chizkiah nofik leimi lo ye'ochel. Chizkiah says, and he actually learned this from Shrotzim, that wherever it says lo ye'ochel, it means issa achila and issa hana. And Rabbi nofik leimi nevela. Rabbi learns out from nevela, from the fact that by nevela it says lo yisaychlu. And nonetheless it says you're allowed to give it, stroke, sell it to a ger, stroke, goy. Where you see it's mutar b'hana, Rabbi learns from there that wherever it doesn't say a special heter, that any issa achila is also b'hana. But the Gemara is now asking a further question. Okay, I understand you're arguing as to what the sources are. Do you learn it out from lo ye'ochel, or do you learn it out from issa nevela, that any issa achila means issa hana? Mechte, however, bein lemar or bein lemar asurim b'hana. Even in those two cases of chometz and Sheir HaNiskel, you both agree it's also b'hana. Mai benayu. So what's the halachic ramification of your machlekes? Answers the Gemara, there is a difference. And you're right, if Rabbi Vo's source is from, like Reb Meir, the way Reb Meir learns nevela, and Rabbi Vo's source is then from nevela, then you're right. Then we cannot find any halachic difference between Chizkiah and Rabbi Vo. However, if you learn like Rabbi Yehuda, that Rabbi Vo's source is not from nevela, it's from treifa, there we have a machlekes. Why? Because what did we say before? We said that from treifa it says that besides for the pasuk saying you're allowed to give the treifa to your dogs, it says oisai. Only treifa is allowed to be given to your dogs, but there are other cases where something that's osa b'achila, similar to treifa, is not allowed to be given to your dogs. It's osa b'hana. What would that be? So according to Rabbi Yehuda, indeed we learn, like we saw before, that you learn from there that oisoi, only treifa you're allowed to give to your animals, but any other case where it's osa b'achila, where there isn't an explicit pasuk saying it's mutar b'hana, it's osa b'hana. And indeed this is the source that according to Rabbi Vo, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that Sheir HaNiskel and chometz b'Pesach is osa b'hana, is learnt out from the word oisai. That lekelev tashlichan oisa, you're only allowed to give the dogs treifa, you're not allowed to give them chometz or Sheir HaNiskel, which is two cases where there's an issa achila, somewhat similar to treifa, and there's no pasuk that says it's mutar b'hana, it's osa b'hana. However, according to Reb Meir who says that you can actually learn from nevela that anywhere where there's an issa achila, there's also an issa hana. And then according to Rabbi Vo, chometz b'Pesach and Sheir HaNiskel, the issa hana is learnt out from nevela. What's Reb Meir going to do with the pasuk of oisoi, that only treifa you're allowed to give to your dogs, but you're not allowed to give something else to your dogs? What would that be? Any other isurei achila would be osar b'hana if in the absence of an explicit exception, you would learn it from nevela. What's this pasuk telling you? It's telling me a case where something is osar b'achila, but the Torah doesn't actually say it's osar b'achila. What would that be? That would be chulin shenishchat ba'azara. If you shecht chulin in the Beis HaMikdash, in the Azara, where it doesn't say explicitly in the Torah that it's even osar b'achila, then there you haven't got a yoichal, something to hold on to and say it's also osa b'hana. So that's what the oisay of lakelev tashlichan oisay is teaching us, that even chulin shenishchatu ba'azara is oser b'hana. But that's all very good according to Reb Meir. But according to Reb Yehuda, who learns that from the oisay you learn out, according to Reb Yehuda, you cannot learn out all Isurim Shabbatayra, Chometz and Sheir HaNiskel, you cannot learn it out from nevela. You have to learn it out from the oisay of treifa. According to Rabbi Yehuda, how's he going to know that chulin shenishchatu ba'azara is osa b'hana? And we already saw this in the Gemara previously. We're going to see it again now. Indeed, according to Rabbi Yehuda, chulin shenishchatu ba'azara is only going to be oser, is not going to be osa b'hana min ha'Torah. That's the sugya according to Tanoim. That's how we work out Reb Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, nevela and treifa. Now let's get back to Chizkiah and Rabbi Vo. According to Chizkiah, Chizkiah learns out that the Issa Hana of Chometz and She'er Niskel is learnt out from Lo Ye Ochel. He doesn't need Oisai to teach us that. So what's Chizkiah going to learn from Oisai? He's going to learn from Oisai the same as Reb Meir. He's going to learn that Chulin Shenishchetu Ba'azara is Asa B'Hana. However, according to Reb Avo, according to Reb Yehuda, he's learning from Oisai that Chometz and She'er Niskel is Asa B'Hana. And according to him, the Issa Hana of Chulin Shenishchetu Ba'azara is actually not Minat Torah. So here we're going to have a Machlekes Chizkiah and Reb Avo, which is what the Gemara is looking for. Ika beinayu Chulin Shenishchetu Ba'azara. Chizkiah says that I don't need the Oisai to say that Chometz and She'er Niskel is Asa B'Hana, because you learn it out from the term Lo Yeh Ochel. Chizkiah Sovar Lo Yeh Ochel Limutehani. The term Lo Yeh Ochel tells me that Chometz and She'er Niskel is Asa B'Hana. So what's Oisai coming to teach us? Limutei Chulin Shenishchetu Ba'azara. That Chulin Shenishchetu Ba'azara is Asa B'Hana. Reb Avo Sovar, Reb Avo learns, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that learns from Oisai, you learn out Oisai Limutehani, because according to Rabbi Yehuda, you cannot learn from Nevela, because Nevela has its unique halacha that's telling us you have to give the Nevela as a gift to the Geir and sell it to the Goy, not vice versa. So you cannot learn the psukim of Nevela to tell us that all Isurim in the Torah, where there's no exception, is Asa B'Hana. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, you learn out from Oisai the Limutehani to teach us that Chometz Pesach and She'er Niskel are also B'Hana, and then Chulin Shenishchetu Ba'azara Lav D'Oraisa Ninu. And then you don't have a pasuk to tell us that Chulin Shenishchetu Ba'azara is also B'Hana. Here you have a machlekes between Chizkiah and Reb Avo. And as a final note, coming back to Reb Avo on Daf Chof Aleph Amud Beis, that Reb Avo said that Kol Mokim Shenema Lo Yoicha Lo Yisoicha Lo Yisoichlu means Issa Chile Issa Hana. That's only correct if Reb Avo is learning Nevela according to Reb Meir. Where according to Reb Meir, it says by Nevela there's Mutar B'Hana, even though it says Lo Yisoichlu. You're not allowed to eat it. And nonetheless, you need a special pasuk to say that Nevela is Mutar B'Hana. He learns from there that everywhere else where there's an Issa Achila, it also means an Issa Hana. However, according to Rabbi Yehuda, if Reb Avo is learning according to Rabbi Yehuda, and he's learning then from Treifa that everywhere else where there's no exception, Issa Achila means Issa Hana, it's not from the words Lo Yoichal, Lo Yisoichal, as he said there. It's actually from the word Oisai. You learn out that Oisai, only Treifa is allowed to be given to the dogs, but any other Issa Achila is not allowed to be given. He's learning it from the Oisai, not from the Lo Yoichal, Lo Yisoichal. Rashi adds that in here at the end of the Sugya. And in Mirat Hashem, in the next Shiur, we're going to continue from here.